I'm Major Olivia Carver, 33 years old, Army Operations Officer. I've spent over a decade keeping combat units supplied, staffed, and alive, doing the invisible work that wins wars before the first shot is fired. For years, I looked out for my cousin Jake, helped him enlist, coached him through exams, even pulled strings to bring him closer to home. But when he mocked my desk job in front of our entire family, calling me a soldier who'd never seen combat, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been disrespected by someone you build up, someone who only learned your value after tearing you down? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from, and if you've ever had to stand your ground after being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe. What happened next might surprise you. I grew up believing family was everything. That blood ran thicker than rank, thicker than duty, thicker than pride. My cousin Jake and I came from the same small town in North Carolina, the kind of place where everyone knew your business before you did. We spent summers at the same lake, sat through the same endless family reunions, shared the same dreams of getting out and making something of ourselves. When Jake was 17 and directionless, failing community college and working part-time at a hardware store, I was the one who sat him down and told him about the Army. I'd already been in for 3 years by then, freshly promoted to first lieutenant, and I saw in him what the recruiters look for: raw potential buried under a lack of structure. He needed discipline, purpose, something bigger than himself. I helped him study for the ASVAB, drove him to the recruitment office, even wrote his initial recommendation letter. The day he shipped out to basic training, he hugged me so tight I thought my ribs might crack. "I won't let you down, Liv," he said. I believed him. Back then, I was 24 and he was 18, and the gap between us felt like protection rather than distance. I'd chosen the administrative and operations planning branch, not because I couldn't handle combat, but because I understood something fundamental: wars aren't won by trigger fingers alone. They're won by supply lines, personnel management, logistics networks that stretch across continents. Someone has to make sure the bullets reach the guns, the food reaches the soldiers, the orders reach the field. That someone was me. Jake went infantry. He wanted the front line, the action, the stories he could tell at bars. I respected that. We all serve in our own way, and the Army needs both kinds of soldiers. For his first few years, we stayed close. I'd video chat with him during his training cycles, helped his mother navigate the labyrinth of military benefits paperwork when his father had a health scare, sent care packages to whatever base he was stationed at. When he struggled with his first board exam for promotion to corporal, I spent hours on the phone coaching him through the study materials. He passed. He always passed because I made sure he had what he needed. Looking back, I can see the pattern I was too close to recognize then. I gave, he took. I supported, he consumed. I elevated, he climbed. The balance never quite evened out, but I told myself that's what family does. You don't keep score with the people you love. His first deployment changed things. He went to Afghanistan for 9 months and came back different, harder, louder, more confident in a way that bordered on aggressive. The gratitude that used to color his messages home faded into something else. Entitlement, maybe. Or just the natural ego of a young man who'd survived something difficult and wanted everyone to know it. He made sergeant at 23, younger than average, and suddenly he was the family's military expert. Never mind that I'd been in for 8 years by then, that I'd managed personnel operations for an entire brigade, that my clearance level was 3 grades higher than his. At family gatherings, he'd hold court about his deployment stories while I sat quietly at the kitchen table, helping my aunt prep food. I didn't mind. I never needed the spotlight. But something had shifted between us, something I couldn't quite name. He started calling my work admin babysitting. The first time he said it, we were at a cousin's graduation party, standing around the grill with uncles and family friends. Someone asked what I did in the Army, and before I could answer, Jake jumped in. "Liv's got the cushy job," he said, flipping a burger with exaggerated nonchalance. "Air-conditioned office, regular hours. Some of us actually get our hands dirty." He said it with a smile, like it was a joke we were both in on. I smiled back, but I felt the sting. My father tried to redirect the conversation, mentioning my recent promotion to captain, but Jake was already moving on, launching into another story about a firefight in Kandahar. I let it go. You let a lot of things go when you love someone. Over the next 2 years, as I advanced to major at 31 and he made sergeant at 24, the distance between us became a chasm. Not in rank, though that gap was significant, but in respect. Or rather, the lack of it. He stopped asking about my work. Stopped responding to my texts with anything more than one-word answers. When I got promoted to 04, I sent him a photo of my promotion ceremony. He didn't even react to it. His social media, though, was full of gym selfies, tactical gear photos, and captions about real soldiers and earning your place. His new crowd encouraged it, younger enlisted guys who saw combat deployments as the only measure of military worth, who viewed support staff as lesser. I watched him cultivate this image, the hardened infantryman, the ground pounder, the warrior. In that narrative, there was no room for someone like me. No room for the logisticians who ensured his ammunition resupply, the personnel officers who processed his hazard pay, the operations planners who coordinated the medevac helicopters that could save his life. We were invisible in his story, and increasingly, I was invisible to him. When I pulled strings to get him transferred closer to home after his second deployment, calling in favors with a colonel I'd worked under, spending political capital I'd carefully accumulated, he never thanked me. He just showed up at the new base and posted about his new chapter like it had happened through his own merit alone. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself he was young, still figuring himself out, still processing whatever he'd seen overseas. I told myself a lot of things to avoid the simple truth. The cousin I'd helped build was now dismissing the foundation I'd helped lay. At a Memorial Day barbecue that spring, he brought some of his army buddies. They were loud, brash, full of the invincibility of men in their mid-20s who'd survived danger and mistaken survival for superiority. I was in the kitchen when I overheard one of them ask Jake about me. "That's your cousin?" "The major." "Yeah," Jake said. I could hear the dismissiveness in his voice through the screen door. "She's got rank, but she's never done anything real. Never been outside the wire, never seen actual combat. Just pushes papers and signs forms. Still, major's major, man. That's solid. Rank doesn't mean much when you've never earned it the hard way." I stood there with a bowl of potato salad in my hands, frozen. Through the screen, I could see him laughing with his friends, easy and careless. He had no idea I could hear him. Or maybe he did. Maybe that was the point. The final breaking point came in November, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. My parents were hosting an early family dinner because half the relatives would be traveling for the actual holiday. I almost didn't go. I was exhausted from a week of back-to-back briefings on a deployment rotation that was turning into a logistical nightmare, 3 units moving to different theaters simultaneously, each with different equipment requirements and timeline constraints. But my mother had asked specifically, and I never could say no to her, so I drove the 2 hours from base to home. Jake arrived an hour late, walking in with that swagger I'd come to recognize, the one that announced his presence before his voice did. He was bigger than I remembered, clearly spending most of his free time in the gym, and he moved through the house like he owned it. My father greeted him warmly, proud of his nephew in uniform. Jake had worn his dress blues, which struck me as odd for a casual family dinner, but I said nothing. Dinner started pleasantly enough. My aunt asked about everyone's work, and the conversation drifted around the table naturally. When it reached me, I mentioned briefly that I was working on a complex deployment rotation. Nothing classified, nothing dramatic, just acknowledging that work was busy. Jake's fork clattered against his plate. "Must be tough," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm, sitting in that air-conditioned office, moving names around on a computer screen. The table went quiet. My mother's eyes widened. My father set down his wine glass carefully. "Jake," my father started, but Jake was already leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, that smirk I'd seen 1,000 times on cocky young soldiers who thought they knew everything. "I'm just saying, we all serve, but let's be real about what that means. Some of us are out there actually doing the job. Actually seeing combat. Actually putting our lives on the line. He looked directly at me. You wouldn't last a day outside your office, Liv. I bet you've never even seen combat. Never heard a shot fired in anger. Never had to make a real decision under pressure. The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt my face flush, felt every eye at the table turn to me, waiting for my response. Waiting to see if I'd defend myself, justify my service, prove my worth to this kid I'd helped enlist 7 years ago. I did none of those things. I just smiled. It wasn't a warm smile or a friendly smile. It was the smile I'd learned to wear in briefing rooms full of field-grade officers who tried to talk over me. The smile that said I knew something they didn't. The smile that came from understanding exactly how much power I actually held. You're right, Jake, I said quietly. I've never been in combat. I coordinated instead. I picked up my fork and took a bite of green beans. The conversation struggled to restart. My father tried to defuse the tension by asking Jake about his training schedule. My aunt mentioned something about the weather. But the damage was done, and everyone at that table knew it. Jake, emboldened by what he mistook for my capitulation, kept going. For the rest of dinner, he made little comments, small digs wrapped in jokes. The real soldiers earn dirt under their nails, not degrees on their wall. Some of us have actually earned our pay. It must be nice to fight wars from behind a desk. Each one landed like a slap, and each one I absorbed without reaction. I just watched him, studied him really, the way you study an opponent before a chess match. I watched him perform for his audience, watched him mistake silence for weakness, watched him confuse my restraint for inability to respond. He had no idea what he'd just done. After dinner, I helped my mother clean up while Jake sat in the living room with my father, regaling him with deployment stories I'd heard 3 times already. My mother kept glancing at me, concern written across her face. He didn't mean it, she said quietly, scraping plates. He's just young. He'll grow out of it. Maybe, I said. I drove back to base that night with the windows down despite the November cold, needing the sharp air to clear my head. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just thought. I thought about every time I'd helped him. Every string I'd pulled, every favor I'd called in, every hour I'd spent coaching him through the system. I thought about the letters I'd written, the care packages I'd sent, the career advice I'd given freely and without expectation of return. I thought about the fundamental misunderstanding at the heart of his mockery, that combat is the only thing that matters, that the trigger pullers are the only real soldiers, that everything else is just support staff pretending to serve. I thought about the soldiers I'd helped get home safely through proper logistics. The medevac coordinates I'd confirmed that saved lives. The supply chains I'd maintained that kept units fed and armed. The personnel assignments I'd processed that put the right people in the right places at the right times. I thought about the quiet, invisible work that makes the loud, visible work possible. And I thought about Jake, so proud of his dirt and his calluses and his stories, having no idea that people like me were the reason he had ammunition for his weapon, food in his stomach, and a chain of command that functioned. By the time I reached base, something had shifted. The hurt was still there, but underneath it was something harder, colder. Not revenge. I'm not that petty, but a kind of clarity. Sometimes people don't understand the value of what you do until they need it. Sometimes they don't respect the system until the system stops protecting them from themselves. I parked in front of my quarters and sat in the darkness for a long moment. Tomorrow, I had to finalize the deployment rotation briefs. Tomorrow, I had to review transfer requests and personnel assignments. Tomorrow, I had to sign off on orders that would send soldiers into harm's way. Tomorrow, I had to do the job Jake thought was so easy. Monday morning came too early. I was in the office by 0600 hours, coffee in hand, already reviewing the stack of personnel folders that had accumulated over the weekend. The deployment rotation I'd been planning for 3 months was entering its final phase, and that meant paperwork, endless, crucial paperwork that would determine who went where and when. My office was small but functional, walls covered with maps and organizational charts, a window that looked out over the motor pool. I'd been assigned to the G1 section, personnel, but my actual job was more complex than that. I sat on the operations board, which meant I was involved in mission planning, resource allocation, and personnel assignments across multiple units. It wasn't glamorous. It was spreadsheets and databases, phone calls and email chains, regulations and policies. It was also the backbone of everything. Colonel Mason stopped by at 0730, leaning in the doorway with his own coffee. He was 52, a career officer who'd come up through infantry before transitioning to operations, and one of the few senior officers who genuinely understood what administrative branches did. "You look tired, Major," he said. "Family dinner last night," I said, not looking up from my screen. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Want to talk about it?" I considered deflecting, but Mason and I had worked together for 2 years. He'd been my raider since I made captain, had written strong evaluation reports, had mentored me through the political minefield of field-grade officer life. If anyone would understand, it was him. So I told him. Not everything, but enough. The mockery, the dismissiveness, the way Jake had made my service sound like a joke in front of our entire family. Mason listened without interrupting, his face neutral in the way senior officers learn to be neutral. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You know what I'm going to say," he finally said. "Let karma teach him." "Yes, sir. People like your cousin, they're so focused on their own small piece of the machine that they can't see the whole picture. They think they're the war, when really they're just one soldier in it. Eventually, reality teaches them. It always does. And if reality doesn't?" Mason smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. "Then they make colonel and become someone else's problem. But your cousin won't make colonel, Major. He'll be lucky to make master sergeant with that attitude. The Army has a way of humbling people who need humbling." He straightened, adjusting his patrol cap. "My advice? Let it go. Don't let his ignorance diminish your service. You know what you do. I know what you do. Everyone in this building knows what you do. That's what matters." "Yes, sir." He left, and I tried to follow his advice. I really did. I turned back to my work, diving into the personnel folders, cross-referencing unit readiness reports with deployment timelines. It was complex work, the kind that required focus and attention to detail. One mistake could cascade into serious problems downrange. But I couldn't shake Jake's voice from my head. "You wouldn't last a day outside your office. You've never even seen combat. Real soldiers earn dirt under their nails." At 1100 hours, I was deep in the deployment roster when a specific folder crossed my desk. It was part of the batch of transfer requests that had been submitted by various unit commanders, requests for personnel moves that ranged from compassionate reassignments to operational transfers. Standard stuff, usually. I process dozens of these every week. This one was different. The name on the folder was Sergeant Jake Carver. I stared at it for a long moment, not quite believing what I was seeing. Then I opened it. Inside was a request from his battalion commander to transfer Jake's squad to a different unit, specifically, to a unit that was part of the active combat rotation headed to an active theater. The request wasn't punitive. It was operational. Jake's unit was being split up as part of a larger restructuring, and his squad was being reassigned to fill gaps in a deploying battalion. It was the kind of move that happened all the time, dictated by readiness levels and mission requirements rather than any individual consideration. The request needed approval from the operations board, which meant it needed my signature. I read through the paperwork 3 times, looking for any irregularity, any reason to flag it or send it back. There wasn't one. Everything was in order. Jake's squad was qualified for the assignment. The receiving unit needed personnel with his specific MOS. The timeline aligned with the deployment rotation. It was perfectly standard. Except it wasn't standard at all, because Jake had been vocal about wanting to stay stateside for a while. He'd told the family at dinner that his next rotation wasn't for another year, that he was looking forward to normal life for a bit, that he was planning to take leave and travel. This transfer would change all of that. This transfer would put him exactly where he'd mocked me for never being, in an active combat zone. I should have signed it immediately. It was a legitimate request, operationally sound, exactly the kind of personnel movement I approved every single day. But my pen hovered over the signature line, and for the first time in my career, I hesitated. Not because I wanted revenge. That would be unprofessional, petty, beneath the uniform I wore. But because I realized, sitting there in my air-conditioned office with my degree on the wall, that I had power. Real power. The kind of power that didn't require raising my voice or defending myself or proving anything to anyone. The kind of power that came from being the person who signed the orders. Jake thought combat was what made soldiers real. He thought the only way to serve meaningfully was to carry a rifle through hostile territory. He had no respect for the structure that supported him, no appreciation for the system that kept him fed and armed and paid. Maybe it was time he learned what that structure actually meant. Maybe it was time he understood that the pen, in the right hands, really is mightier than the sword. I set the folder aside and moved on to the next one. The folder sat on my desk for 2 days. I didn't avoid it exactly, but I didn't address it either. I processed other transfers, approved other assignments, worked through the mountain of administrative tasks that constituted my actual job. But that folder stayed there, always visible in my peripheral vision, waiting. Colonel Mason noticed on Wednesday afternoon. He'd stopped by to discuss a different personnel issue and saw the stack of unsigned documents. "You're usually faster than this, Major," he said, not accusatory but curious. "Just being thorough," I said. He picked up the top folder, not Jake's, thankfully, and flipped through it. Everything looked standard. "What's the holdup?" I could have told him. Should have told him, probably. Instead, I just said, making sure all the details align. "These are combat rotations. I want to be certain." He nodded, accepting the explanation, and left. But his question lingered. What was the holdup? I knew the answer, even if I didn't want to admit it. The holdup was me wrestling with the weight of what I was about to do, or not do. In the military, everything is about authority and responsibility. You have authority over your domain, and with that authority comes responsibility for the consequences of your decisions. I had the authority to approve or deny Jake's transfer. I also had the responsibility to make that decision based on operational needs, not personal grievances. The question was whether signing off on a legitimate transfer request counted as personal if it happened to serve a secondary purpose. Thursday morning, I arrived at 0500 hours, before anyone else in the office. I made coffee, sat down at my desk, and pulled out Jake's folder one more time. I read through every page again, checking and rechecking. The operational justification was sound. His unit was overstaffed in his MS. The receiving unit was understaffed. The deployment timeline matched the training cycle. His performance reviews were strong enough that he was exactly the kind of NCO they needed. There was no regulation, no policy, no guideline that would justify denying this request. If I denied it, I'd have to provide a reason, and "my cousin was rude to me at dinner" wasn't going to fly. If anything, denying it would be the abuse of authority, not approving it. And yet, I knew that signing this paper would change Jake's life. Would take him from the comfortable stateside assignment he'd been enjoying and drop him into exactly the situation he'd claimed to want, the one he used to measure every other soldier's worth. I thought about what Colonel Mason had said about karma. About letting reality teach the lesson. Maybe this wasn't me engineering revenge. Maybe this was just me getting out of the way and letting the system work exactly as it was designed to work. Maybe Jake needed to be in that environment, needed to see what combat logistics actually looked like from the receiving end, needed to understand that the bullets and beans don't just appear by magic. Maybe the best thing I could do for him, as his cousin and as an officer, was to approve a transfer that would teach him what I apparently couldn't. Or maybe I was just rationalizing. Maybe I was using operational justification to paper over the fact that I wanted him to feel a fraction of what I'd felt when he diminished my service in front of our family. Maybe the professional and the personal were so tangled up at this point that I couldn't separate them anymore. I sat there for 20 minutes, pen in hand, staring at the signature line. Then I signed it. Just my name, neat and precise, in the space marked Approving Authority. Approved. Deployment. Active Zone. Effective, December 15th. I attached the required routing slips, placed the folder in the outgoing box for processing, and moved on to the next item on my agenda. The decision was made. There was no taking it back. The rest of Thursday passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls. I briefed the battalion commanders on the deployment timeline, coordinated with the logistics section on equipment transport, reviewed medical readiness reports. Normal work. The kind of work that keeps an army functioning. At 1700 hours, I was packing up to leave when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Then I realized it was Jake's number. I deleted it months ago after he stopped responding to my messages, but the area code was familiar. You wouldn't. That was all it said. 3 words. No context needed. I stared at the message for a long time. He'd found out already. Someone in his chain of command must have notified him that afternoon, given him the news that his comfortable stateside assignment was about to become a 6-month deployment to a combat zone. And his first thought was to text me. His first assumption was that I'd done this to him, which meant he knew, on some level, exactly what he'd done at that dinner. Knew it was wrong, knew it had consequences, knew that I had the power to affect his life in ways he'd never considered. I didn't respond. What was there to say? The transfer was legitimate. The orders were cut. The system had made its decision through the proper channels, and I was just one signature in a chain of many signatures. One officer doing her job. I deleted the message and drove home. That night, lying in bed in my quarters, I waited to feel guilty. Waited for the regret to set in, for the weight of what I'd done to press down on me. It didn't come. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt since that dinner, calm. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense of rightness. Like the balance had finally shifted back to center. Jake had spent years taking my support for granted, years dismissing my service as lesser, years building his identity on a foundation of looking down on people like me. And now he was going to spend 6 months learning exactly what people like me do for people like him. Maybe he'd come back humble. Maybe he'd come back angry. Maybe he'd come back exactly the same. But that wasn't my responsibility anymore. My responsibility was to the mission, to the army, to the soldiers whose lives depended on me making sound operational decisions. I'd made one. The system would handle the rest. Friday morning, my phone started ringing at 0630 before I'd even made it to the office. My mother. I let it go to voicemail. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, there were 3 more missed calls. My mother again, my aunt, and a number I didn't recognize, but suspected was Jake's mother. I sat in my car for a moment, engine off, staring at the screen. So he called home. Had spun whatever story he was going to spin about his unreasonable cousin who'd sent him to war because of a little dinner table banter. Never mind that I didn't make deployment assignments, that those came from unit commanders based on readiness and operational needs. Never mind that his orders had been cut through proper channels and would have happened regardless of my involvement. In Jake's narrative, I was the villain. I was the petty officer who'd abused her authority. I was the reason his comfortable life was about to get uncomfortable. I turned off my phone and went inside. The day was full of meetings I couldn't skip, a briefing at 0800 with the brigade commander, a logistics coordination call at 1000, a personnel review board at 1300. I moved through them mechanically, present but distracted, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It dropped at 1500 hours when Colonel Mason called me into his office. "Close the door, Major," he said. His tone was neutral, but I'd worked for him long enough to catch the undercurrent. I closed the door and stood at attention. "At ease," he said. "Sit." I sat. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I got an interesting call this morning," he said. "From a Captain Morrison, Jake Carver's company commander. Seems Sergeant Carver is very upset about his transfer orders and believes they were processed inappropriately." My stomach tightened. "Sir, he held up a hand. "Let me finish." "Captain Morrison explained the situation, that you and Sergeant Carver are related, that there was apparently some family tension recently, and that Carver believes you personally arranged his deployment as retaliation." Mason paused. "He's asking for an investigation into whether you abused your authority." The words hit like a physical blow. An investigation. If the Army opened an investigation into my conduct, even if I was cleared, it would be a mark on my record. It would follow me through every promotion board, every assignment, every evaluation. It could end my career. Sir, the transfer was operationally justified, Mason finished. I know. I pulled the file. I reviewed the request, the unit readiness reports, the deployment roster. Everything is by the book. Captain Morrison knows it too, which is why he's trying to approach this delicately. He doesn't actually think you did anything wrong procedurally, but he's got a sergeant making noise, and he has to be seen to take it seriously. He leaned forward. So let me ask you directly, Major. Did you approve that transfer because it was operationally sound, or did you approve it because of what happened at that family dinner? I met his eyes. Both, sir. The honesty surprised us both. I could have lied. Could have given him the clean answer he probably wanted, the one that would make this easier. But Mason deserved better than that, and so did I. Both, I repeated. The transfer was operationally justified. His unit is overstaffed, the receiving unit needs personnel with his MS, the timeline is appropriate. I would have approved the same request for any sergeant in the same position. But yes, sir, part of me knew what it would mean for him specifically. Part of me thought he needed to learn what combat operations actually look like from the supported end rather than the supporting end. And part of me. I paused, choosing my words carefully. Part of me was tired of being dismissed for doing the job that keeps soldiers like him alive. Mason was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. That's what I thought. He pulled out a folder, Jake's transfer request, with my signature clearly visible. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to tell Captain Morrison that I reviewed the transfer personally and found it entirely appropriate. I'm going to note in my review that Major Carver disclosed her family relationship with Sergeant Carver, but proceeded with proper protocol regardless. I'm going to recommend that Sergeant Carver accept his orders and report as scheduled, and that any further complaints be directed through the proper grievance channels rather than through informal family pressure. He closed the folder. And then you're going to write a brief memo to file documenting the approval process for this specific transfer, noting every regulation and policy you followed, every operational consideration that went into the decision. You're going to make that file bulletproof, because if Carver does push this up the chain, you need to be able to show that every step was by the book. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, he said. Because here's the other thing that's going to happen. You're going to call your family and explain, in whatever terms you're comfortable with, that you did not send Jake to war. That the Army sent Jake where the Army needs him, and that you were simply one person in a chain of approvals. You're going to do this because otherwise this is going to fester, and family messes have a way of becoming professional messes. I nodded, throat tight. And Major. He looked at me, his expression softening slightly. For what it's worth, I don't think you did anything wrong. Personally or professionally. But you need to be ready for the fact that your family might not see it that way. They're civilians. They don't understand how this works. And Jake is going to spin this however he needs to spin it to avoid taking responsibility for his own situation. I understand, sir. Dismissed. I spent the next hour at my desk writing that memo, documenting every step of the transfer approval process in excruciating detail. By the time I finished, it was 17:30, and the office had mostly cleared out. I sat alone in the fluorescent quiet, staring at my phone. I'd turned it back on after the meeting with Mason, and the messages had multiplied. 7 missed calls now. For voicemails. A dozen texts, ranging from concerned, "Honey, please call me," to accusatory, "How could you do this to him?" I listened to the voicemails in order. My mother, confused and worried. My aunt, angry and protective of her son. My father, trying to be neutral but clearly upset. And finally, Jake. His voice was different than I'd ever heard it, shaky, almost tearful. "Liv, I know I messed up at dinner. I know I said things I shouldn't have. But this? Sending me to a combat zone because I hurt your feelings? That's not okay. People die over there. You know that. This isn't just about making me eat crow or teaching me a lesson. This is my life." He paused, and I could hear him breathing. "I'm sorry." "Okay. I'm sorry for what I said. I didn't mean it. Just, please, pull the orders. Fix this. You're the only one who can." The message ended. I sat there for a long time, phone in hand, feeling something crack inside my chest. Not guilt exactly, but a recognition of what this actually was, not karma, not justice, but two people who loved each other failing to bridge the gap between their worlds. I couldn't pull the orders. Even if I wanted to, they were already processed, already moving through the system. Jake's unit had been notified, his deployment timeline set, his equipment manifest prepared. You don't just reverse that kind of machinery because one soldier got scared. But more than that, I didn't want to pull them. Because despite the fear in his voice, despite the family pressure, despite the guilt trying to worm its way into my chest, I still believed he needed this. Not as punishment, but as education. The weekend was miserable. I avoided my phone, avoided my family, avoided thinking too hard about what Monday would bring when Jake's orders became official and irreversible. I went to the gym, ran until my legs ached, lifted weights until my arms shook, trying to exhaust myself into not feeling. It didn't work. Saturday evening, I finally called my mother. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with worry and anger. Olivia Marie Carver, what have you done? Not Liv. Not Honey. My full name, the one reserved for when I disappointed her. I did my job, Mom. Your job is to send your cousin into a war zone? To put him in danger because he said something rude at dinner. My job is to process personnel transfers based on operational needs. Jake's unit was selected for deployment by his commander, not by me. I just signed off on the paperwork. Don't give me that military talk, she said, voice rising. You know what I mean. You could have stopped it. You could have made a phone call, pulled a string, done whatever it is you do to fix things. You've done it before for him. Why not now? Because he needed to learn. Because I was tired of being his fixer. Because he'd crossed a line and needed to face consequences. Because the system shouldn't bend just because someone has a cousin in the right office. I said none of those things. Mom, Jake is a sergeant in the United States Army. He signed up for this. Deployment is part of the job. It's not a punishment. It's the job. He'll be fine. He's trained, he's qualified, and he'll have his entire unit with him. He's scared, Liv. He called me crying. That landed harder than I expected. I know. Then fix it. I can't. The orders are cut. His chain of command has been notified. The unit is preparing to deploy. There's no fixing it at this point. There's always a way if you want to find one. And there it was, the fundamental assumption that had underlaid our entire relationship. That I could fix anything, that I had unlimited power to rearrange the world to protect the people I loved, that my authority existed primarily to serve my family's needs. No, Mom, I said quietly. There isn't. And even if there was, I wouldn't use it. Jake needs to deploy. He needs to see what combat operations actually look like. He needs to understand that the military is bigger than his squad, bigger than his pride, bigger than his ego. So this is about pride? About teaching him a lesson? No. It's about him doing his job. The same job thousands of other soldiers do every year. He's family, Olivia. So am I said. And that didn't stop him from humiliating me in front of everyone we know. It didn't stop him from mocking my service, dismissing my work, treating me like I'm not a real soldier because I don't carry a rifle. Where was the family loyalty then? Silence on the other end. Then, softly, he's young. He didn't mean it. He's 26, Mom. He's not a child. And he meant every word. The conversation deteriorated from there. She accused me of being cold, of letting my career make me hard, of forgetting what family meant. I defended myself, then stopped defending myself, then just listened as she vented her fear and anger. We didn't resolve anything. We ended the call with that particular kind of silence that meant we'd both said things we couldn't take back. Sunday, I went to the base chapel. I'm not particularly religious, but I needed somewhere quiet to think, somewhere removed from phones and messages and the weight of everyone's expectations. The chaplain was there, an older Army Reserve colonel who'd been activated for the deployment rotation. We talked for a while, not about Jake specifically, but about the weight of command, the burden of making decisions that affect other people's lives. The hardest part of leadership, he said, is accepting that you can't make everyone happy. Sometimes you can't even make the right people happy. You just have to make the sound decision and trust that the outcome will prove its worth. What if it doesn't? Then you learn from it and make the next decision. That's all any of us can do. Monday came. Jake's official deployment orders were published. I saw them in the morning reports, his name on a roster of 200 other soldiers, all preparing for the same rotation, all facing the same uncertainty. He wasn't special. He wasn't being singled out. He was just one more sergeant doing what sergeants do. At 10:00 hours, my email pinged with a message from Captain Morrison, Jake's company commander. Subject line, Sergeant Carver. I opened it, expecting another request for reconsideration or another accusation of impropriety. Instead, it was brief and professional. Major Carver, after reviewing the deployment orders and discussing the situation with Sergeant Carver, I want to confirm that we have no concerns about the transfer approval process. SED Carver has accepted his orders and will deploy as scheduled. He has also withdrawn his informal complaint. Thank you for your service. V/R, CPT Morrison. I read it twice, then leaned back in my chair. So that was it. Jake had backed down, realized he had no case, or simply accepted that this was happening regardless of how he felt about it. The machine had moved forward, indifferent to his preferences. At lunch, I got a text from him. I'm sorry. 2 words after weeks of silence. I stared at them for a long time before responding. Me too. Because I was. Not for signing the orders, I'd do that again, but for the way we'd gotten here. For the years of accumulated resentment, the failures of communication, the gradual erosion of respect. For loving someone and still letting them down. Or maybe for loving someone enough to let them face consequences. I wasn't sure anymore. December passed in a blur of preparation. Jake's unit went through pre-deployment training, equipment checks, family readiness briefings. I followed it all from a distance, monitoring the reports that crossed my desk, watching his unit move through the machinery of deployment like every other unit. I didn't reach out to him. He didn't reach out to me. The silence between us felt both necessary and devastating. Christmas came and went. My parents invited me home, but I declined, claiming work commitments. The truth was I couldn't face them yet, couldn't sit through another dinner where I'd be the villain in Jake's story. I spent the holiday on base, volunteering to cover duties so officers with young children could take leave. It was easier that way. On January 3rd, Jake's unit deployed. I wasn't there to see him off. That would have been inappropriate, given everything, but I received the notification when their transport lifted off from Dover Air Force Base. 1,700 hours, right on schedule. 200 souls heading into an active combat zone. One of them was my cousin. I sat at my desk and allowed myself one moment of doubt. One moment of wondering if I'd made the right choice, if my certainty had been justified, if sending Jake into danger just to teach him a lesson was worth the cost if something went wrong. Then I closed the file and moved on to the next task. Because that's what you do in the military. You make the decision, you file the paperwork, you trust that you followed the right process. And then you move forward. February brought its own challenges. A different deployment rotation, different personnel issues, the endless cycle of soldiers moving through the system. I threw myself into work, pulling 12-hour days, volunteering for additional duties, avoiding the quiet moments when doubt could creep back in. Colonel Mason noticed. "You're burning yourself out, Major," he said after a particularly long briefing. "I'm fine, sir." "You're not. And I need you functional, not running yourself into the ground out of guilt over a decision you had every right to make." "I'm not, Major." He waited until I met his eyes. "You did the right thing. For him, for the mission, for the integrity of the system. But that doesn't mean it's easy. Give yourself permission to struggle with it." I nodded, throat tight. That night, I got my first letter from Jake. Not an email, not a text, but an actual handwritten letter, sent through military mail. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to open it. When I finally did, sitting alone in my quarters with a glass of whiskey I wasn't really supposed to have on base, the words were not what I expected. "Liv, I'm not going to pretend this is easy. The first week was hell. Culture shock, heat, constant vigilance. Everything they trained us for, but more intense, more real. I was angry at you. Honestly, I'm still a little angry at you. But I'm starting to understand what you were trying to tell me. Last night, Our resupply convoy was delayed by 6 hours because of some logistics issue. We were down to our last water rations, almost out of ammunition for a scheduled patrol. Everyone was pissed, blaming the support units, talking about how people back on the FB don't understand urgency. Then the convoy showed up. 40 trucks, organized down to the last crate. Water, ammo, food, medical supplies, mail. Everything we needed, delivered exactly where it needed to be despite the delay. And I thought about you. About your desk job. About the fact that someone, somewhere, had to coordinate all of that. Had to know what we needed before we needed it, had to plan routes and schedules and security, had to process 1,000 requests and prioritize resources, and make sure nothing fell through the cracks. I finally get it. Not completely, maybe, but enough to know I was wrong. I'm sorry for what I said at dinner. I'm sorry for how I treated you. I'm sorry I didn't understand that your work matters just as much as mine, maybe more, because without it, mine becomes impossible. I don't know if you pulled strings to send me here or if this really was just the army doing army things. Honestly, I'm not sure it matters anymore. I needed to be here. I needed to see this. I needed to learn what I was too arrogant to learn any other way. Thank you. I think. Or maybe screw you. I'm still figuring out which one. Jake, I read the letter 3 times, and by the 3rd time, I was crying. Not from relief, though there was relief, but from the weight of understanding that sometimes the hardest thing we do for the people we love is refuse to protect them from growth. I didn't write back immediately. I needed time to process, time to let his words settle. But 2 weeks later, I sent a simple response. Stay safe, Sergeant. Proud of you. Short, professional, but true. March brought another letter. Then April brought 2 more. Jake's tone evolved with each one, less angry, more reflective. He wrote about the work his unit was doing, the people he was meeting, the ways he was learning to see beyond his own limited perspective. He wrote about a conversation with his platoon sergeant, a grizzled E7 who'd served for 18 years, and who told him that the best infantry soldiers are the ones who understand logistics. Because you can't kill what you can't reach, and you can't reach what you can't supply. He wrote about missing home, but also about finding purpose in the deployment, about understanding that service comes in many forms and all of them matter. And slowly, carefully, he wrote about us. About the cousin who'd helped him enlist, the major who'd taught him hard lessons, the family member he was learning to respect not despite our differences, but because of them. I wrote back more regularly after that. Not long letters, I didn't have time for long letters, but brief updates, encouragement, the occasional bit of advice. We were rebuilding something, but it was different now. Not the old dynamic where I gave and he took, but something more balanced. More equal. More real. June brought news that Jake's unit would be returning in late July. 6 months in theater, right on schedule. The deployment had gone relatively smoothly. No major casualties in his company, mission objectives achieved, personnel returning with experience and, for most of them, new maturity. I monitored the redeployment timeline with the same attention I'd given the original deployment. Transport schedules, customs processing, equipment turnover. All the logistics that would bring 200 soldiers home safely. Among them, one cousin who'd left angry and was returning, I hoped, transformed. Colonel Mason asked if I planned to attend the welcome home ceremony. I don't think that's appropriate, sir, I said. Why not? He's family. Exactly. It would look like favoritism. He smiled. Major, you've spent 6 months proving there's no favoritism in how you do your job. I think you've earned the right to welcome your cousin home. I considered it. The old me would have gone, would have been first in line with a welcome home banner, would have made sure Jake had everything he needed for his transition back to stateside life. But I wasn't that person anymore. I'll think about it, sir. In the end, I didn't go to the ceremony. Not out of spite or anger, but because I thought Jake needed to come home on his own terms, without the complication of me being there. He needed to reunite with his parents, his friends, his life without immediately dealing with the complex history between us. I did, however, arrange for a care package to be waiting in his quarters when he arrived. Nothing dramatic, just some basics that soldiers always need after deployment. Good coffee, decent snacks, a new set of workout clothes, a gift card to a restaurant in town. The kind of thing I'd send to any soldier I cared about. I included a note. "Welcome home, Sergeant. Coffee's on me when you're ready. Liv." 3 days after his unit returned, he called me. "Hey," he said, voice uncertain. "Hey, got your package. Thanks." "You're welcome." Silence stretched between us, the kind that held years of history and months of letters, and the entire weight of what we'd been to each other and what we were becoming. So, he finally said, "Coffee?" "Yeah, coffee." We met at a diner halfway between base and his hometown, neutral territory for both of us. I got there first, nervous in a way I hadn't been nervous in years. When Jake walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. He was thinner, harder in some indefinable way. The swagger was gone, replaced by something quieter but more solid. He slid into the booth across from me, and for a moment we just looked at each other. "You look different," I said. "So do you." "I haven't been to a combat zone." "No, but you look." He paused, searching for the word. "Tired. Like you've been carrying something heavy." He wasn't wrong. The last 6 months had been the most difficult of my career, not because of the work, but because of the emotional weight of knowing I'd sent him there, knowing that if something had gone wrong I'd have lived with that choice forever. It's been a long 6 months, I admitted. For both of us. The waitress came, took our orders, disappeared. We made small talk for a while, his flight home, the terrible coffee on the transport, the chaos of out-processing. Surface stuff, safe stuff. Then Jake set down his coffee and looked at me directly. "I need to say this, and I need to say it right. I was an arrogant jerk. Not just at that dinner, but for years. I took your help for granted. I disrespected your work. I acted like my way of serving was the only way that mattered. And I was wrong. Completely, fundamentally wrong." He paused. "I don't know if you actually pulled strings to send me on that deployment or if it just worked out that way. Part of me thinks you did. Part of me thinks the universe just has a sense of humor. Either way, I needed it. I needed to see what you do from the other side. I needed to understand that logistics isn't boring, it's everything. That administration isn't hiding, it's the foundation that makes combat possible. That your work is just as hard and just as important as mine, just in different ways." I felt tears threatening, but held them back. "Thank you for saying that. Thank you for not giving up on me. Even when I deserved it." We talked for 2 hours. About the deployment, about his experiences, about the ways he'd changed. About my work, about the pressure of command, about the weight of making decisions that affect people's lives. About our family, about the rift that had formed and how we might begin to repair it. We didn't solve everything. 6 months of deployment doesn't erase years of complicated history. But we started. We found a foundation to build on, a mutual respect that hadn't existed before. When we left the diner, Jake hugged me. Not the casual family hug from before, but something genuine and tight and grateful. "Proud of you, Major," he said. "Proud of you too, Sergeant." Over the next few months, we rebuilt our relationship slowly. Coffee meetings turned into occasional dinners. He started asking about my work, genuinely interested, wanting to understand the systems he'd previously dismissed. I asked about his, learning about infantry operations from someone who could now explain them without arrogance. He began mentoring younger soldiers in his unit, especially the cocky ones fresh off their first deployment. I heard from his company commander that Jake had become one of the most effective NCOs in the battalion, someone who understood both the tactical and the strategic, both the combat and the support. We attended a family gathering in September, the first time we'd seen each other in that context since the infamous dinner. The tension was palpable when we arrived, everyone watching us carefully, waiting to see how this would play out. Jake stood up when I walked in. Before anything else, he said to the room, "I need to say something. Last time we were all together, I said some things about Liv's service that were completely out of line. I was wrong. She serves this country with as much dedication and courage as any soldier I've ever known, and I'm proud to be her cousin. I'm proud to serve in the same army." He raised his beer. "To Major Carver. One of the best officers I know." The room was silent for a moment. Then my father raised his glass and others followed. My mother was crying, relief and pride mixed together. And I stood there, overwhelmed, realizing that this was what I'd wanted all along. Not revenge. Not punishment. Just recognition. Just respect. Just the acknowledgement that my service mattered. That I mattered. 2 years later, I stood in front of a mirror in my dress blues, adjusting the new rank insignia on my collar. Silver Oak Leaves, Lieutenant Colonel. Oh, 5. I'd been promoted 6 months ahead of my peers, a below-the-zone selection that represented the Army's confidence in my abilities and my future. It had been a long road from that family dinner, from the moment Jake had mocked my desk job and set into motion a chain of events that had transformed both of us. The promotion ceremony was at 1400 hours. Family was invited, and for the first time in years, I'd invited all of them without reservation. My parents, my aunt and uncle, cousins, even some extended family. And Jake. Jake, who was now Staff Sergeant Carver, E6, promoted ahead of his peers just like I'd been. Jake, who'd matured into the kind of NCO that junior officers requested for their platoons. Jake, who'd learned the hard way that leadership isn't about swagger or arrogance, but about service and humility and understanding your place in something larger than yourself. The ceremony was held in the brigade conference room, a formal affair with the brigade commander presiding. Colonel Mason was there too, retired now but invited back for the occasion. He'd been instrumental in my career, and having him present meant everything. The room filled with soldiers and family. I stood at attention as the orders were read, as the brigade commander spoke about my service, my accomplishments, my potential for continued leadership. Then came the moment. Mason and my father stepped forward to remove my Major Oak leaves and replace them with the Lieutenant Colonel insignia. My mother pinned the new rank on my cover. When it was done, I turned to face the room. Applause, handshakes, congratulations. My mother hugged me tight, crying happy tears. My father told me he was proud, his voice rough with emotion. Friends from my unit congratulated me, already joking about how I'd probably be colonel before I hit 40. And then Jake stepped forward. He was in his dress uniform, looking sharp and professional. No swagger, no arrogance, just a soldier honoring another soldier. He came to attention and rendered a crisp salute. "Congratulations, ma'am," he said formally. I returned the salute. "Thank you, Sergeant." For a moment, we stayed like that, officer and NCO, the proper military protocol maintained. Then he broke into a grin and stepped forward for a hug. "Seriously, Liv. So proud of you. You've earned this 10 times over." "So have you," I said. "Staff Sergeant at 29. That's impressive. Had a good teacher." He paused. Even if her teaching methods were a little unorthodox. We both laughed, and the tension that had existed between us for so long finally, fully dissolved. After the ceremony, there was a small reception. People mingled, ate cake, told stories. I found myself in a corner with Jake and Colonel Mason, the three of us talking about the state of the Army, about deployment rotations, about the constant challenge of balancing readiness with personnel needs. "You know," Mason said, looking between us, "you two represent something important. The integration of combat arms and support branches, the understanding that we all serve the same mission in different ways. The Army needs more officers and NCOs who understand that." "Took us a while to get there," Jake admitted. "The best lessons usually do," Mason replied. Later, as the reception wound down, Jake and I stood outside in the late afternoon sun. My family was gathering for photos, but we'd slipped away for a moment of quiet. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said. "Sure. Did you actually pull strings to send me on that deployment? Or did it really just work out that way?" I'd known this question would come eventually. We'd danced around it for 2 years, but now, with everything settled between us, he deserved an honest answer. "Both," I said. The transfer was operationally justified. It would have happened regardless of our relationship. But I knew what it would mean for you specifically when I signed off on it. I knew it would take you out of your comfort zone. And I thought you needed that. Were you right? Were you wrong? About me, about my work, about what it means to serve. He thought about that for a long moment. "No, I was wrong. Then I was right." He nodded slowly. "I should probably be angry about that. Probably. But I'm not. Because you were right. I did need it. And I'm a better soldier, a better NCO, a better person because of it. He looked at me seriously. But promise me something. What? Promise me that if I ever get that arrogant again, you'll just tell me instead of sending me to a combat zone. I laughed. Deal. My mother called us over for photos. We walked back together, falling into step naturally. Someone had set up a camera, and the whole family was arranging themselves, parents in the middle, children and grandchildren around them, the usual organized chaos of family photos. But then my father had a different idea. Jake, Liv, he called. Stand together in uniform. I want a picture of both of you. We stood side by side, Jake at attention, me with my new rank gleaming in the sun. The camera flashed, capturing that moment, two branches of the same family tree, two soldiers who'd found their way through conflict to mutual respect. Two people who'd learned that sometimes the hardest thing we do for the people we love is hold them accountable. That night, alone in my quarters, I looked at the photo someone had texted me. Jake and me, both in dress blues, both standing tall. You couldn't tell from the photo the journey we'd taken to get there. You couldn't see the hurt or the anger or the months of deployment that had changed us both. You just saw two soldiers, two family members, two people who'd figured out how to honor both their relationship and their duty. I printed the photo and put it on my desk, next to my promotion orders and the letters Jake had sent from downrange. Reminders of what we'd been through, what we'd learned, what we'd become. The next morning, I reported to my new position as Battalion S1, a significant increase in responsibility and visibility. My first task was reviewing personnel files for an upcoming deployment rotation. I opened the first folder, saw a name I recognized, a young specialist who'd been vocal about support units being non-essential to combat operations. I smiled. Some lessons you learn in a classroom. Some lessons you learn in the field. And some lessons you learn by experiencing firsthand the weight of the machinery you thought you understood. I picked up my pen and began to work. Because that's what you do. You serve. You lead. You make the hard decisions. And you trust that the people who need to learn will learn, even if the path to understanding isn't comfortable. Especially if it isn't comfortable. The work continues. The lessons continue. And somewhere between duty and family, between authority and compassion, between the easy choice and the right choice, we all find our way forward. One signature at a time. That's my story, no drama, just consequences. If this hit home, tap like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that support roles are still frontline. Questions for you. Have you ever been dismissed by someone you helped succeed? What did you do? If you serve or have served, what invisible job kept your mission alive? Where's the line between helping family and enabling them? Would you have signed those orders? Why or why not? What's one boundary you're setting this week?